Good morning, Devin.
Hi.
Please allow me to introduce Dr. Devin Zuckerman from the Contemplative Sciences Center at the University of Virginia. And the reason for my inviting Devin to participate in this interview is that I listened to a podcast where I heard Devin speak about the elements and those elements of, say, earth, air, fire, water, and space being present inside the human body and in mirroring to the relationship of how they're present outside of the human body. And I was so interested in that because for me, that's the fundamental basis of what connection is. Connecting right down at that level. That's our earliest level of connection, is to be connected with the planet that we're standing on. So I'm wondering, Devin, if you could talk a little bit about that. Maybe firstly introduce, let us know what you're doing and what your passions are, and then talk about those, the inner and the outer elements, and what you understand about them according to your research.
Sure, yeah, completely. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And I'm really happy to be here. And it's been really nice getting to know you a little bit through this interview process. So I'm Devin Zuckerman. I guess I'm an academic by by trade, by practice. I'm uh, trained in religious studies. I just finished my doctorate in religious studies at the University of Virginia. And like you said, I'm currently a researcher at the Contemplative Sciences Center at the University of Virginia and a climate fellow with the Environmental Institute, also located at the University of Virginia, which is in the state of Virginia in the US. Yeah, and as for my research, my dissertation research also, as you said, was on the elements, earth, water, fire, wind, and space, or air and space, in a Tibetan Buddhist contemplative tradition known as the Great Perfection. And I looked at texts and sort of histories of contemplation with the elements within a set of contemplative documents or contemplative kind of manuals known as tantras, beginning in the 12th century, and then a kind of history of interrelated texts that talk about these things over time. Yeah, yeah. How's that for for a start?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, can you just provide a little definition about contemplative, what that is in
Yeah,
the
sure.
context of your research?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So, at the lab where I work at the Contemplative Sciences Center, or CSC, we're talking about this a lot, kind of an emergent definition of what contemplative is, or what contemplation is sort of starting to arise in our work. And the way that we're talking about it is kind of this twofold definition, including practices that people do to elicit experiences of transformation, practices that people do as individuals, as communities, in connection with other human beings and with the more than human world. But contemplative also refers to kinds of experiences that can emerge kind of spontaneously or as the result of like a curated set of circumstances. So we're talking about it in terms of those two things, but the way I think about contemplation, or the way I define contemplation, is in an attempt to be as kind of radically inclusive of experiences and practices as possible. Because I'm much, I guess I would say I'm much less interested in kind of like excluding or defining against, like what contemplation isn't, like what kinds of actions and activities are contemplative and what aren't, is sort of less interesting to me than the contemplative aspects of all the kinds of practices that we do as human beings in connection with our world and with others. Yeah, if that makes sense.
So I heard you talking about practices, and then I heard you talking about experiences, which I'm guessing are occurring places.
Yeah,
So what
exactly.
might be a practice and what might be a place that occurs in to get this type of experience?
Sure, sure. Yeah. So examples of contemplative practice, like contemplative is sort of designed to be a sort of umbrella idea that includes kinds of practices like meditative practices and yoga, and also, the things that we define as meditation or yogic practices, right? And I'll say I come from a Buddhist studies background. I think I said that when I was talking about my dissertation. So my orientation to what is contemplative is sort of naturally based on South Asian traditions, but there are global histories of contemplative traditions that include Western Christian traditions and Kabbalistic traditions and, you know, Sufi practices of zikr and other kinds of like transformative and mystical practices, and of course indigenous practices as well, including American indigenous practices, which are, you know, since I'm from, you know, the US, that's an interest of mine, but global sort of indigenous practices as well. So yeah, so it's kinds of practices that people do that involve some element of attention, a kind of attentional practices, and that result in kinds of transformation, or that are designed to result in kinds of inner transformation. So yeah, like I said, a meditation practice in which you're focusing your attention on your breath, right, is the kind of classic example from the Buddhist tradition. But I think that contemplative practices can also involve, you know, kinds of healing practices, as well as storytelling practices, singing, right? All of these things have contemplative elements, or can have contemplative elements when they're sort of infused with a kind of intentionality and a kind of attentional awareness. Yeah.
So to bring the transformative element, is the outer required? So a natural environment, or what is the sort of outer experience that will help along that transformation that occurs as a result of opening those inner processes?
Yeah. Thanks I remember this also as part of your earlier question, like kinds of places that elicit contemplative experience. Yeah, that can be a lot of things. In my work, I talk a lot about place and like the contemplative affordances of land, water, and air. And, you know, the contemplative affordances of the land might be, for instance, in the research that I do and the kinds of practices that I study, it might be proximity to like rushing water, to downward flowing water, like a waterfall or like a rushing river or something like that, where there is not only the sound of water, which can be an anchor for meditation, an object of meditation, but also the feeling of being near water has this very distinctive quality to it. You can maybe feel the temperature change, and you can feel the spray of the water, and it has a certain kind of smell because of the ecology of the watershed, right? So it has a sort of very distinctive feeling, and you know, I think a lot about the kind of negative ions, like the kinds of there's a sort of like electric energy that's created from water, from the energy of like water colliding with itself, kind of at the molecular level, that produces a kind of feeling. So in the text that I have been studying, they talk about that as a kind of contemplative affordance that elicits kinds of experiences of ecological belonging, or some researchers, you know, the scholars who are writing the materials in the 12th century that I study, they don't talk about like pro-sociality or kin relationality, right? Or these things, but those kinds of affects are there, like a sense of connection with a more than human world, with a kind of cosmological world that's bigger than the individual. Kin relationality in the sense of, again, this kind of ecological belonging and relationship with sentient beings in the, you know, distinctively in the Buddhist world, in the Buddhist cosmology of the 6 realms, you know, this kind of thing. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing as you're talking is that in order to transcend that inner world that we often get locked into and traps us, depending on how much control we have over that, most of us have very little. What I hear you talking about is quite a powerful, exposing ourselves to quite powerful outer experiences. So the waterfall, you know, I was going along with your descriptions and I was hearing the sound of the water rushing, and then you introduced smell and I was smelling the water, and then I was thinking about the rock that I was sitting on, and then I'm thinking that's a really powerful outer experience. And so those experiences are so powerful, they actually force us to come out of our mind and go, oh, look at that. So I'm wondering, just to bring this into a Western context, I was thinking, Maybe I could sit behind a major freeway and convert that sound to the sound of rushing water. And maybe I can do that larger connection by opening. Is it the power of the connection, or is it the occupation of all of the senses that that facilitates that connection for transformation? I mean, most of us live in very noisy, cluttered, encroaching cities, and if we could find a way to use that as a powerful outer experience and engage with it and accept it and walk into it rather than try to like distract from it. I've gone a little bit off topic here, but I'm trying to nut out what the elements are of that connection that you're talking about to something greater than us, which helps us do something that we can't really do if we stay locked away in our own little inner worlds.
Yeah, I know. It's such an interesting question. I know I wish I had like the formula, like I have all the pieces that because I read the way that these practices are described. But in terms of like what makes a contemplative practice transformative, it's like hard to say like what are the specific elements that we could sort of extract and recombine in a new innovative way in order to produce similar kinds of experiences. I mean, that's a question I'm very interested in because I think contemplation it can be very generative in that way. Like, I don't think it's what you're saying. Like, is there a way to relate with the sound of the freeway in a way that can be? We say freeway. I don't know if you said that. That's like our major roadways, right? That's like a very American sort of thing to say. Anyway, so like, yeah, is there a way to relate with that in a way that can be contemplative, right? And I think the answer is definitely yes. I don't know what it is exactly, but I think there's room for like a generative way of doing contemplative practice. I think there's like certain conditions of like view and like where the practice is headed and things that shape practices and make them functional. And then I think there's also room for kind of generativity and working with what we have, what conditions are available to us.
Because it sounded like I could feel a deep, as you were describing it, I could feel a deep healing. Like I was putting myself next to that powerful waterfall. I was letting go of everything. And I was thinking that can bring the body to such a profound state of rest that the contemplation is that you can actually observe what it is that comes up for you, sort of unbidden. And those elements, that deep connection, it's not only deep connection with the external world, but it's a deeper connection inside of ourselves. So we're dropping more deeply into ourselves as well. And perhaps that's what the transformation is. And I imagine it'd be very hard to do next to a freeway and quite natural next to a waterfall.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? Because this is like very interesting to me. Yeah, if you don't mind, would that be okay?
Yeah.
When you were, it happens a lot that you describe some of these, you sort of offer some of these sensory experiences to someone, and they have these vivid internal, like sensory connections. I wonder, when you were saying you're like sitting on a rock and you're visualizing this place in nature, is it a place you've been before, or is it an entirely new place?
Entirely new place.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I wonder about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting.
I guess we cobbled together what we know. I brought out what I know of the smell of water. I've got a stored memory for the smell of water. I've got a stored memory for the sound of water. And I just, it comes together in a preconceptual sort of.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I'm very, incidentally, a bit of new research that I'm doing is also very interested in kind of the phenomenology of that thing of like, where do these experiences come from and what are they like? Especially as it relates to the senses, right? We can have these kind of multi-sensory experiences just through the suggestion of someone describing them. And we can sort of, communicate sensorially across, like, we can give each other sensory experiences, and I think when we talk about connection, also there's something about the communication, that's happening here, but also the sense of connection that we have to past environments that we've known, and past experiences that we have that sort of become a meshwork in this sort of elicited sensory experience that seems very like singular and sudden, but it's actually it's sort of a kind of monument to our relationships with worlds that exist already,
I guess that's the power and connection of the guided meditation or any sort of guided contemplative practices, is that, oh, please help me. I mean, I cannot get myself out of this space that I'm in. I need to connect to you, even if you're just a virtual recording, to help me move. And even in that self, it's a transformation, because we're not speaking major life transformations or awakenings here. We're just speaking of transformations of this current mental state that I find myself stuck in. So
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think it also speaks to the kind of relational nature of contemplative practice in general, something I'm also very interested in, that like we think the sort of stereotype about meditation is that it's done alone, like in a room quietly or something, but actually it's like foundationally deeply relational, because it involves a transmission, maybe from a teacher to a student, and a whole history, and it involves connection to past experiences and others we've known. And yeah, so it can be very relational in that way.
Okay. Yeah. I'll just ask you one final question, if I might.
Sure. Yeah.
So if we don't have a practice of, say, going out into nature and not even structurally or intentionally saying I'm going out to get connected, but when we walk into nature, we just get connected. So what are we missing out on by not actually incorporating this as an intentional practice, saying I need to go and get my connection this week or today or whatever? What are we missing out on when we don't value that connection, that inner outer experiential connection?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, one thing, if I may, I'll just like say, like back up for 1 second, which is to say, I think we are connected to nature almost always. I think, in fact, like this kind of is related to my, one of my kind of great somatic teachers who lives in the Bay Area on the West Coast of the US, who's named Julie Henderson. She's a somatics teacher. And she says in one of her books, I think very profoundly, that we're already in relationship with everything, and all of those relationships are equally strong. And I think about that all the time. And especially I think it's relevant to this question of like, what do we miss out on when we're maybe not connecting it, let's say in a profound way, with like the natural world. I think our definition, a very kind of binary definition of what is nature, like might prohibit us or be sort of an obstacle to us realizing that we're already in connection with these things. Like nature is also in our body. So like when we connect to sort of what we're feeling in our body, when we connect to like, even when we open a window, or we step outside and we feel the change of the temperature of the air and this kind of quality of movement, like that's the air element. It is like motion itself, any kind of experience of motion. And that's a connection to nature. Or like seeing the little animals, like we have some birds and little squirrels and stuff outside. And it's kind of nice to do like a little bit of like exchange of self and other with the animals. Like sometimes I think, there's this teaching that comes from this Buddhist text called the Bodhicharyavatara, or the Way of the Bodhisattva. And it talks about, in the commentarial tradition, talks about exchanging, like you exchange self and other with the beings that you see. So you just exchange the first person and the third person pronoun. So the squirrel runs by and I say, oh, I run, or the bird flies and I say, oh, I fly, right? That can be like a deeply sort of transformative experience of nature, right? So I think like if we're missing out on anything, we're missing out on the reality that we're already connected, and that there's opportunities for connection all the time. And those opportunities are like drawing us. They're constantly, the world itself is constantly inviting us into relationship with it, I think.
That's such a beautiful way to finish. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been so lovely. Yeah. Thank you.